Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Shana Marshall. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute for Middle East Studies at the George Washington University, and we are very excited to be hosting this event today in collaboration with MERIP, the Middle East Research and Information Project. James Ryan, who is the Executive Director of MERIP, will be moderating today's discussion. So I will turn it over to him. We won't do lengthy introductions, but he'll let you know who the panelists are today. And I've also put in the chat a link to the Institute's website for our future events, including our largest event of the year, which is our annual conference, which takes place next Friday, the 25th. That'll be in person and online. And please, if you have any questions, feel free to add them using the Q&A function at any time during the panel. And thank you so much again for joining us, and I'll turn it over to James.
All right, thank you so much, Shana. It's great to be with our community and with our colleagues at IMES. We've partnered, MERIP and IMES have partnered on many initiatives over the years, and I want to thank you all for their leadership and the staff at IMES for helping put this together. At MERIP, if you're new to us, we're really thankful for your support and the support from our readers. We're a small nonprofit that really runs on the comradeship of all of you in our audience and our community of readers. So thank you for spreading the word about what we do, sharing our mission, and when possible, chipping in a few bucks to help us keep the lights on. If you're new to us, likewise, I'm going to throw some links in the chat later to some of our latest pieces and where you can read about how to support what we do. So on to our program for today. Today we're joined by three incredibly sharp analysts to discuss the ongoing protest movement in Turkey, which has been the latest development in a drama that we might say began with the reignition of a peace process between Ankara and the PKK back in the fall, and then accelerated following the surprising success of the Syrian rebel groups led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a Turkish client, in ousting Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Following, in the month or two following that, we've seen the arrest of Istanbul's mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, who was at the time, preparing to be the nominated challenger to Erdogan for the presidency. He's a leading figure in the opposition, in the political opposition in Turkey, which then sparked, a series, an ongoing series of protests, the largest of its kind that we've seen in several years in Turkey. So we're bringing together a group of folks today to really discuss what's happening, why it's happening, and what we should all be paying attention to more closely as things unfold. With us today is our three really close, friends of mine in the field, really. And I'm really excited to have the three of them with us. Selim Koru is here. He is a fellow at the Economic Policy Research Foundation in Turkey and the Foreign Policy Research Institute in the US. He is the author of an excellent new book, New Turkey and the Far Right, How Reactionary Nationalism Remade a Country. He also runs a fantastic Substack called Kulturkamp. Originally, when we announced this event, we were going to have Fulya Pinar with us, but unfortunately she couldn't be with us at the last minute. But we are very, very grateful to Cihan Tekay Liu joining us today to pinch in for her. Cihan is a doctoral candidate in anthropology at the City College of New York, and the co-editor of the Turkey page over with our comrades at Jadaliya. Welcome, Cihan, and thank you for being with us. And lastly, but certainly not least, we're joined by Gönül Tol, who is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and the author of another really excellent book, not quite as new, but still very, very relevant, Erdogan's War, A Strong Man's Struggle at Home and in Syria. Welcome, Selim, Cihan, and Gönül. It's great to be with you.
Thanks for having
Thanks for having us.
Selim, I want to start with you and maybe ask you to set the table for us a little bit here. To the casual observer, two things that might be basic assumptions about Turkish politics over the last decade or so is that it's been militantly opposed to the Kurdish movement and relatively immune to mass protest. I'm thinking here of Gezi, which was violently suppressed in 2013, but many other smaller movements that have cropped up in the time since then. You know, and then in addition to the crackdowns on Kurdish activism, you know, in really since 2015 and the collapse of the peace movement, the first peace process there. The past 8 months or so might suggest some of those presets are changing. Do you think they are? I mean, what's surprising about what's happened so far to you in the past as these events have unfolded?
Yeah, I think some of that is semantics and some of that is actual change. So on the Kurdish issue, so the question that a lot of people have is, well, there's now a Kurdish peace process. Does that mean that the government or the state no longer has a problem with the Kurds? And is this going to be a genuine outreach to the Kurdish citizens of Turkey? I don't think that's quite the case. It is the case in a limited sense, right? So the Kurdish movement, when we say the Kurdish movement, we're really talking about leftist Kurds, and we're particularly talking about a leftism that's derived from the tradition of the PKK, or at the very least isn't really opposed to the tradition of the PKK, right? After the Gezi Park protests in 2013, as you mentioned, there was this whole new sort of left-wing, left liberal, Turkish Kurdish synthesis, and the HDP sprang out of that, right? And the HDP got 13% of the vote at the time, which was huge for a mainly Kurdish party to get that much of, to be that successful, especially in the Western cities in Turkey, meant that the Kurdish movement had achieved a connection with Turks in the major cities, progressive Turks in the major cities. And that was really special. That was something important for them. Now, what's happened since then is that the Syrian civil war, obviously, which Gönül knows a lot more about than all of us, but when that happened, I think the Kurdish movement had this idea that they were going to have a presence in the field, kind of. They were going to be able to shape facts on the ground in Syria in a way they weren't able to in Turkey, because the Turkish military had always suppressed the PKK. And Turkey's sort of the state quest then became, okay, go over to Syria and squash that project, Rojava, as thoroughly as possible. They've now done that. So I think Turkey has absolute military supremacy on these things. The only reason Rojava still exists is because it's allied with the Americans, it seems to me. And that is also looking very shaky. So we're at a point where left Kurdish militant sort of projects are coming to an end. And I think they're kind of realizing this as well. And the Kurds are kind of sick of having to bear the weight of leftism in Turkey, because they've gone over to the Turkish left over and over again. They've tried to carry the Turkish left. There's always this discussion, and they've gotten no thanks for it. The Turkish left isn't really as respectful to them as they want it to be. So they're kind of separating now, becoming a little less leftist, a little more Kurdish nationalist, dealing with Erdogan separately, right? But at the same time, their overall movement is defeated in the field militarily. And that's, I think, what makes these talks possible. But if we look at that and say, okay, this is the state granting Kurdish rights to the Kurds or the left Kurds, no, that may be. I think that's just going to be very limited. Now, on your second thing, the state being immune to large-scale protests, I think that, I mean, when people look at this sort of thing, especially when it's people who maybe have an idea of Turkey, they've been there, they've read a couple of books, they don't follow it full time, right? Sometimes people have this idea that, it might be something like a color revolution. It might be something like, the Maidan protests happened in Ukraine, and that clearly switched things and brought to power a different kind of politics. The color revolutions were more extreme, obviously, versions of this. That's really not the case in Turkey, right? The Erdogan regime, right, was a government before it was a regime, right? It was a popularly elected government. It's still very popular in Turkey, right? And so it's not going to be sort of toppled like Mubarak was or something like that, right? It's a very robust structure. But what these protests mean is something special, I think, because the Erdogan people weren't ever really willing to cross a certain line. They weren't lawful, right? They didn't really adhere to the constitution very well. They broke a lot of very, very big rules and laws, violated the constitution at the highest level many times. But they didn't really interfere with the electoral system directly. And that's because they couldn't. They probably, maybe they thought about it, but then every time they must have concluded that, there'd be blowback. There'd be pushback from the population, and that eventually that would make them weaker, right? This was always a movement that tried to win elections and tried to get most of the country on board. And they now seem to have overcome those inhibitions. Imamoglu's arrest means, really, to the vast majority of the population, I think, it means that we have no problem arresting you if you get too good at electoral politics, because we just don't have the luxury of losing this. Right? Because they haven't been governing in a way that would suggest that they would be okay handing over power to an opposition force. That makes us different, and that I think is like a very deep change in Turkish politics today.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, I think what we're hoping to do here is for the casual observer sort of understand how the ground really is shifting over the last 8 months, both in terms of the relationship with the Kurds, and largely as a result of what's happened in Syria, and in terms of this escalation being really deep and dramatic, even if it's a practice that's been in place in Turkey for quite a long time. And we'll talk about that. I mean, removing mayors arbitrarily is something that Erdogan's been doing a long time. It's just that now it's happened to his most, sort of threatening political opponent, or the guy who's been perceived to be the greatest threat. And so I want to turn to Cihan to ask a bit about Imamoglu. He's a figure who's kind of maybe come into international consciousness relatively recently. He's, got, what a position that people understand to be, the most threatening to Erdogan in a head-to-head election. Ostensibly he will be the CHP's candidate whenever elections are next called. But what about Imamoglu makes him atypical of CHP politicians of recent vintage in your mind? How would you describe the kind of like political economy that undergirds this outpouring of support for the now jailed mayor? What makes him a little bit different? What makes him powerful?
Yeah. You can hear me well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. This was a fun question to think about. I think it's both him, and we see signs that it's both him and the CHP changing. But I'll get into him first because it's kind of fun to think about the political economy of this because it's universal, actually. It's universally understandable. So the main thing is Istanbul is a city of 15 million people, and the entire country is like 85 million people. And that's like 1/5, 1/6 of the country. And it's the most cosmopolitan city in Turkey. It has internal migration from everywhere, right? And also traditionally, a lot of people like who come from the Black Sea, just like İmamoğlu, like they go home in the summer to their towns, to their villages, connect with their families, etc. And Istanbul had this like reserve of successful politicians. Just actually, Erdogan was one of these who climbed to the national stage from being successfully governing Istanbul. It's just like a massive job, and you have to make a lot of various sectors happy to be able to do that. How he got there is he was actually, because we have metropolitan municipality there, and there's district municipalities because it's so huge. And he actually was the mayor, the district mayor of Beylikdüzü, which is this up and coming neighborhood that became up and coming after the 99 earthquake. So it was gentrifying, essentially, like people were looking for safer housing. And it was like, previously it was more of an industrial neighborhood. It's like, it has a seaside port, but now it's transitioning to a much more like service economy and real estate economy. And it didn't really belong to any one party, really. And he was maybe like the perfect person to like rise up in CHP cadre by running a neighborhood like this that symbolizes like a new coming politics that has a lot of constituents like that are not the base of any party yet, that didn't belong to any party yet, or they were open to like shifting their alliances. So in a way, to me, it looks like, thinking about this now, I had to think retrospectively, and I'm thinking that was maybe like a microcosm of what he had to do when he became the metropolitan mayor of Istanbul. At the same time, what makes him different is, I think, number one, that like straight up just like good governance, very like scientific governance, and kind of shifting away from culture wars and focusing on like urbanism, like serving this urban public, and really like how can we help people, bread and butter issues, like in a very like social democratic, I would say, bread and butter issues in a like city where a lot of people are struggling, right, where the economy has been getting worse and worse. And I think also like initially when he came up, this wasn't as clear to me, but now that I had to think back, like it is this kind of shift. Like initially when in the period that Selim was describing, when the Kurdish movement was making moves on the national stage to make Turkish left bigger, CHP was tacking right and running candidates like Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu or Mansur Yavaş, like people who really come, either like İhsanoğlu was more of an academic, like Islamic scholar, but like I would say the mayor of Ankara, like Mansur Yavaş, really comes from the Nationalist Movement Party. Like it was like before Nationalist Movement Party started collaborating with AKP, there was like this opening where maybe there would be a different alliance between CHP and MHP. So that was the strategy. İmamoğlu doesn't come from that, but he does come from a family that is rooted in, his father is rooted in the Motherland Party. This is like a 1980s center-right party. He was in the youth wing of this party before he briefly before he like kind of became his own person. So I think this is very relatable. So he doesn't actually come from a right-wing tradition. Like he did come up in CHP cadre, but his family I would say like a lot of people's families, like they're relatable, has like people who are like his mother wears the veil, like his wife doesn't, like, and I think beyond the culture wars, like this is very relatable to a lot of people in Istanbul and a lot of people in Turkey. Like you're realistically, unless like you're very, you know, like blue blood Istanbul or something, you're gonna have a lot of people in your family who are this mix, who like parts of the family you're married into might come from a different city. People might wear the veil, might not wear the veil. They might have different, like, you know, ethnicities, or they might be like Sunni or not, more secular. I think like on the ground, beyond the polarization, there's this reality in Turkey, and he tapped into that, and they tap into this kind of as a family as well. So his wife became has been a political figure, and during this protest emerged more prominently. And to me, actually, they remind me, and this has been a little bit controversial when even if when they had a little bit contact, of Selahattin Demirtas and Başak Demirtas, like these like new Gen X politicians who are like putting themselves forward, and they appeal to both like the younger people and the older people who want things to change. And maybe this is also universal as well. Like in the world, we're talking about how like kind of an older generation is like holding on to politics, like not really giving up. So I think like whatever kind of wherever they are in the spectrum, like these like kind of politicians born in the 1970s, even 1980s, now like we're seeing millennials rising in politics in the US as well. Like this is kind of like uh and like I think in the US, and I'm not now trying to think whether in Turkey, like younger people and older people poll very, very differently. And like we have like the biggest point differences in terms of like how we think and what we want and this. So I think there is also that. And uh yeah, this is what I'm thinking. So in a way it is. So the other thing is, to me it seems like CHP itself shifted, and there's more room for these newer people, like Kılıçdaroğlu's retirement, Özgür Özel chairing the party. There was a lot of questions whether this was like a real shift or not, but like all the evidence that I'm seeing is that after the latest earthquake a few years ago, like CHP took all these, it wasn't like instant, like it didn't make a big difference in the presidential election, but there were municipal elections countrywide after that. And a lot of municipalities, some of whom that I would think of like near AKP bases, went to CHP, like not just in Istanbul, but in the southeast as well. So and in other parts. So there seems to be a different kind of like more organized infrastructure in CHP, and like their cadres are coming up from that. And as well, like when İmamoğlu became Istanbul mayor, he kept some of the existing cadre there. Like that was also like a sign of kind of this like non-partisan governance that was like against patronage. So he kept a lot of the workers in the municipality, but he added the Istanbul Planning Agency, which had a lot of these like newer, younger, left needle-leaning, left urban planners, like, and you know, like, yeah. So I think it's a combination of all these things, like really like on the one hand, so far İmamoğlu, Özgür Özel, chair of the party, kind of to me they signify this, like they're like strong in their values, they're strong in their social democratic values, which CHP was criticized very much for that in the years before that. Like, why are you trying to rebrand Islamist or MHP candidates, as CHP candidates, in hopes of appealing to like the right. And this is kind of a change in that, is that actually now we have people who came up like as like more like social democratic cadre, but Imamoglu is also like kind of an outlier in that he comes from this like business construction, like family, like very much, like I want to say like in Southern Europe, we think of this like business parties as the center-right parties, and then like social democrats come from like teachers, bureaucrats, etc. And CHP has like followed that in a way. So he's an outlier, but he's an outlier kind of in a good way, because his values are social democratic mostly. Of course, there's like the secular nationalist like ideology is there, but it's like moves away from culture wars and focuses on bread and butter issues. And people want to see a party that's fighting, but fighting over the right things, like democracy, against nepotism, etc. So that's kind of what I see, like in how like both he might be special, but also he reflects a wider change where it looks to me like from the outside, that, and a little bit from talking to like people who work like on the bureaucratic side of the municipalities, that like there is an environment where people can breathe and cadres can come up, and that's a big shift, and like kind of prying the political arena from the hands of older cadre, let's say. So like democratization. And we really saw that when the CHP did these like open primaries, like everyone from like my my aunt who's like ex-workers party, like diehard CHP, to my mom who's skeptical, to like my friends who are millennials who are very CHP skeptical but kind of on the left. Everyone that I know in that spectrum was very impressed with that. Like just like in all, like there's all these ballot boxes on the street, and it's like open primaries, and like really kind of, I think people were looking for the opportunity to participate in the process and like show consent and like show, yeah. So I think it is both him and like a wider change in hopefully the democratic processes of the party that I hope will continue.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there was this generational shift that is reflected in all of this, and it bears noting that these protests have been led by students, by and large, and these students are a different generation than the students who were out there, in Gezi in 2013, and have a different kind of orientation. The political parties, I mean, we'll talk about this, but the political parties are interacting with the protests in a way that they didn't before. There's a lot, happening about the way that the party functions, and also I think you're also right that Imamoglu is in a similar way to Erdogan, unique for his political background, right? He has a certain set of values that are in line with a particular party, but he has an affect, he has a family structure and a background that allows him to transcend that in so many ways. And Erdogan was in a pretty similar spot. So I think just from that comparison alone, you can see why Erdogan sees him as a threat, because he sees a lot of himself in him in a way, or is looking in the mirror, in some respect. Gönül, I want to come to you to ask also about some of these questions, but particularly in light of the sort of fallout from the ouster of Assad. I mean, it seems clear to me that Erdogan is attempting to capitalize on the victory of Ahmed al-Shara in Syria. Erdogan has been feted as kind of the hand behind the movement in many corners, most prominently by President Trump when he was sitting next to Bibi Netanyahu a week ago in the Oval Office. Certainly, the response to the protests suggests he feels he has a tremendous advantage domestically as well. I mean, the repression is deepening. The media is facing a newer round of attacks. Thousands of activists and journalists have been arrested. It seems to me like with every round of repression, we're faced with this question of whether he's gone too far this time. And Selim kind of prefaced this as well. I mean, has he? What do you make of Erdogan's stability in the light of these events?
Thank you, James. Before answering that, if I may say a few things on the previous questions that you put to Selim. The first question was, is this a genuine, is the recent Kurdish opening, we can't even decide on what it is called, but is this opening a genuine effort to resolve the Kurdish question? So that was the first question that you posed. And my short answer is no. Because the Kurdish question is fundamentally a matter of democracy and human rights, and you cannot expect an autocrat to deliver democracy and human rights. So I'm skeptical. But everyone involved, they have their own agenda, right? Erdogan has his own reasons for to pursue this. He wants to get re-elected in 2028, and there are regional reasons, drivers behind this too. And you have Abdullah Öcalan, the PKK's imprisoned leader. He's been in jail for many years now, and he wants this to be his legacy. And the third actor, the PKK, as Selim mentioned, has lost this war militarily. The war that it's been waging since 1984. And it's been defeated. And also on the political front, it has been losing ground among key constituencies in Turkey, particularly after 2015, and that was when the PKK decided to carry its fight to rural centers, and then that was when cities were destroyed, and that really weakened the popular appeal of the PKK among the Kurds. And also things might get even more complicated for the PKK, both in Iraq and also in Syria. In Iraq, the US is getting ready to withdraw from Iraq, and that will leave more room for Iran to play a bigger role. The expectation is that Iran will play a bigger role there, but this comes at a time when Iran has been really, and Iran's proxies have been really weakened. So that is one consideration that the PKK cadres in northern Iraq have. And also in Syria, now there's a pro-Erdogan government in Damascus. There are negotiations going on, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. So those are the motivations of the PKK. So all these actors, they have their own agenda and their own vision. But here is the main question. There's just too much gap between those different visions. I mean, I'm not sure whether the PKK is ready to settle for what Erdogan is willing to grant. And of course, the biggest question is, what do the Kurds want? I don't know if you've seen, there was a recent public opinion poll suggesting that the Kurds overwhelmingly, they do want peace. But even if there was this particular question put to them that was, if Selahattin Demirtas, and Demirtas is the former co-chair of the pro-Kurdish party who's been in jail. So the question was, if Erdogan releases Selahattin Demirtas, would you vote for Erdogan in return? And the answer was an overwhelming no. So we're talking about a Kurdish constituency that is really strongly anti-Erdogan. So how do you square that? And that's one of the reasons why I'm very skeptical about whether this opening will deliver any real results. And the second question you put to Selim was whether these protests that just erupted surprising. I think they surprised me, and I know that they surprised a lot of people. And there are two reasons for that. One is, historically, street protests have not been regarded as a legitimate tool in Turkish political culture. And that has something to do with the violent nature of these street protests in the 1960s and 70s. So violence is directly associated with those street protests. And that's why it hasn't been a very popular way of expressing frustration. And the second reason why they are surprising is because in 2013 the Gezi protests erupted, and since then Erdogan has taken a lot of steps to make sure to intimidate those who were thinking of taking to the streets. And we live in a more autocratic, I mean, Turkish people live in a more autocratic country, right? So that's why these protests came as a big surprise. They were led by students, but embraced by a majority of people. Again, another public opinion survey conducted after this suggests 73% of respondents said that those people protesting on the streets are right. So they have legitimate grievances, and that is a change from the last biggest mass protest in 2013, Gezi protests, right? Gezi protests, although they were a huge rejection of Erdogan's vision for the country, they started as a very narrow agenda, which allowed Erdogan to frame the entire movement as the work of a fringe youth, right? So he cannot do this now, because right now you see, yes, it's led by students, but you see people from every walk of society, and they are really voicing problems that is just beyond the arrest of İmamoğlu. So in that regard, it really touched a nerve, which to me was surprising. And to your last question, I mean, whether Erdogan has gone too far, yes, I think it's fair to say that Erdogan has gone too far. But let's unpack what that really means. He's been chipping away at Turkish democracy for years, right? But arresting his top rival, that is a major escalation, even by Erdogan's own standards. So the question is, why did he do it? I think first, he felt he had to. Erdogan hasn't fully consolidated his grip, and he's facing serious challenges, an economy in crisis, slipping support in key constituencies, and a wildly popular opponent who could beat him at the ballot box. And second, he did it because he thought he could get away with it. I don't think he anticipated the level of public outrage we've seen since İmamoğlu's arrest. He probably expected some pushback, but I think he assumed that it would fade and he would just ride it out before the next election, which is in 3 years. And also, let's not forget, he's operating in an international climate that emboldens leaders to take these kinds of aggressive steps against pro-democracy forces. So now, does Erdogan regret the move? Some say the economic backlash has made him rethink. But I'm not so sure. He made this decision on the very day his finance minister was pitching Turkey to international investors, right? So he had to know that there would be consequences. He calculated the risk and figured he could manage it. What he probably does regret is that the legal case against İmamoğlu was so flimsy. And I say flimsy in quotes because the whole thing is fabricated. But if the case had been more convincing, I mean, even just cosmetically, I think Erdogan could have wrapped things up faster and muted some of the backlash. So, but that said, his plan hasn't really worked. His goal was a tightly controlled autocracy with no electoral surprises, right? And that's not what he got right now. And in fact, the opposite might be happening. CHP leader Özgür Özel has really stepped up to the surprise of a lot of people. He's become the voice of all those frustrated by Erdogan's rule, and he's in many ways channeled public anger into mass protests. And importantly, he's let young people, especially university students, take the lead. And not just because of İmamoğlu's arrest, but because they see their futures slipping away. And Özel has struck the right tone, in my opinion. He said the right things, and he re-energized the opposition. So this, I think this moment has revived faith in the CHP. But the real challenge now is sustaining that momentum for the next 3 years. The party is calling for early elections, but I doubt Erdogan will go for it. Not while the streets are still boiling. So is Erdogan in a stronger position today than before İmamoğlu's arrest? No. Can he recover by 2028? I think that depends almost entirely on whether he can turn the economy around.
Yeah, I think you're right on. About that he probably miscalculated his own political capital in this case. And I think he's also done that in the past and found a way to dial up repression to just the right level of tolerance that sort of quiets his enemies and allows him to consolidate. I think a lot of that does remain to be seen. And I thanks for also chiming in on this Kurdish peace process issue, because I think to me it's almost inseparable from what is happening and what may happen. On the one hand, because it seems to me that it's a Kurdish movement, and particularly Öcalan, negotiating from a position of weakness. And for me, it's really called to mind, not only the Oslo process between Palestine and Israel in the early 90s, but the critique of the Oslo process was that it was a capitulation, right? The criticism that this was not a peace process, but a surrender in a lot of ways.
We don't know what the Kurds will get in return. I mean, all we hear from the pro-Kurdish party is that Öcalan's conditions will be improved. Well, good for him, but that doesn't do much to the Kurdish cause itself and the fight for rights.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to turn back to Selim here to sort of pull him in on the issue of the protests, because I think Gönül and Cihan both noted, like, they're interacting with the politicians in a very different way than we're used to seeing, right? If we think about the history of mass movement or protest, under Erdogan, we really do begin with Gezi, which was a moment, if we all remember, that was kind of a leaderless set of protests that the CHP, which Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, a different generation of politician, had recently come into power and really couldn't find his footing within that movement or how to take advantage or capitalize on it. But then in subsequent years, attempted, perhaps in vain, to pull off some old stunts. He had this march across the country at one point. He tried and failed to really put himself at the head of a popular movement. But now we have this younger generation of leaders in the CHP, İmamoğlu, Özgür Özel, which we didn't know until really right now had a capacity for managing some kind of mass mobilization or movement. What does that tell you about the likelihood that protests may continue, that how mobilization might be amplified in the coming months, and what kind of challenge that might pose to Erdogan?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with with pretty much everything that was said by that Cihan and Gönül said. I think on the way forward, it's interesting to realize that at this point we're beyond party politics, right? People don't really talk about party politics anymore. The goal isn't necessarily, are we going to win elections or I don't think that's the kind of question that the CHP is necessarily asking itself right now. It's more about resistance and how do you generate political power, because the political landscape really can't be taken for granted. well, we know that there's going to be this election scheduled for 2028, but I feel like when I hear the CHP, they're not really thinking that that's a very firm thing. This seems to be fair, a global phenomenon. You know, Trump comes in and has these huge tariffs and stuff. People have a hard, because it's so extreme, people have a hard time taking that on its face value. People assume that those tariffs aren't going to be there. And in much a similar way, people in Turkey assume that, you know, it's not going to be free and fair elections in 2028 because of all that's happened and all that's going to happen up until that point. So your politics isn't really about, you know, how do we organize within electoral districts and you know, put forward the right candidates. If you put forward the right candidates and they do what they're supposed to do in a normal system, they're just going to get arrested anyways. Because guess what? I mean, İmamoğlu did that, right? He got elected in Istanbul, performed well, as Cihan explained to us. He was doing well on the identity politics front, and he was doing really well on the policy front. And that's precisely why he got arrested, right? So you can't really think in those terms anymore. So I think even the CHP gets that now, right? And you know, it's taken a long time, but it seems like they're on it now. Personally, I don't think it was really about analytical capacity. You know, it's not like these people, you know, look at the same thing that everybody else is looking at. All these analysts, not just us. You know, everybody's looking at and saying, "Oh, I don't understand what's." It's more about what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, the lines you're willing to cross, right? And I think, especially in those early days, it was like there was a moment. I think so. After the İmamoğlu arrest, news came out. I think most people over the age of 35 or so just felt defeated, right? Most people were like, okay, you know, we kind of knew that would happen, but we were kind of hoping not. But most people felt like they're just gonna keep going with this, and there's nothing else any of us can do. And then this footage came out of Istanbul University of Istanbul, and then from other universities, right? It was really these university students really led the charge, and when they gathered at Saraçhane, they were kind of goading the CHP people there on. They were like, okay, you have to lead now. And the CHP people really felt that kind of bottom-up pressure coming. And that's when by the second day, they knew what they had to do. And when Özgür Özel said specifically, when he said we're going out on the streets, as Gönül said, that was an important taboo that he broke, because Kılıçdaroğlu had always said politics isn't for the streets; it's for the ballot box. You can't go out in the streets, because that's the line that Erdogan had kind of drawn, right? You have to preserve normality. You have to pretend that there is a system, even though the system is rigged against you, right? So he crossed that threshold, and I'm guessing that when he crossed it, he understood that if he fails, he'll probably go to jail, right? So the stakes are high for him too. So he has to succeed to some extent. So at that point, it really became a contact sport, I think, and the chemistry shifted. And what else was I going to say? So I think going forward, what people are experimenting with in Turkey right now is just the idea that you take this to an extreme, right? Because the deal, the tacit agreement up until now in Turkish politics was, okay, we hold elections, Erdogan wins, and then you pretend that the system works up until the next election, right? You don't, because the tacit agreement is, okay, you do politics around election time, and then when it's not election time, or when it's not a political contest, you don't express yourself politically. When you go to the shopping mall, you don't do political stuff. When you go to your job, you're not very political, right? And what people are saying with these boycotts is, no, everything is political now. And something similar is happening in the United States as well with, these Tesla riots and all these things, because people understand that, if the government is hollowed out, and if the constitutional system, as we've taken it for granted for decades and generations, is hollowed out, then all bets are off. The agreement that we had is off, right? So everything becomes very, very politicized all of a sudden. Young people seem to understand it much more than older people, which is why they lead the boycotts. But yeah, I think that's what we're sort of getting into, still fairly gradually, but that's the territory, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really insightful, and I think you're right. I hope you're right about the comparison to the American context. I've sort of, even since Trump's first election, I've had this sort of axiom from Noam Chomsky in my head about the ballot box being actually a break from politics, not politics itself, right? Like, the actual politics happens outside of election context. It's putting structures in place, movements in place, peoples in places where they understand that what they're doing is political, right? And I hope you're right about that comparison. I do want to note that we're coming up on an hour, and I have one more question for Cihan and Gönül. But if you want to ask a question of the audience, please put it into the chat. You can either send me a direct message or put it into the chat for everyone to see. And actually, I did have one here that's probably even a more pertinent question than what I had sort of preloaded here. So Cihan and Gönül, I want to put it to both of you, actually, because I think you might have an interesting response. We have a question here from one of our audience members wondering about the possibility of right-wing anti-Erdogan elements joining with the CHP in this protest movement. I mean, the main political problem of opposing Erdogan that the opposition has failed to bridge in so many elections so far has been, we need a coalition that includes right-wing nationalists and Islamists in opposition to Erdogan, left-wing Kurds, social democrats in the middle, and how do you bridge that, right? Are we any closer to building that kind of coalition in the opposition in Turkey as a result of these protests and İmamoğlu's arrest? Cihan or Gönül, do you have a thought towards that?
Yes, sure. Well, we have for some time now, we have been there's been a growing anti-Erdogan nationalist movement, right? With E Party, with Victory Party, so they're still there. E Party is mostly unlike the far right party MHP. It's not a one single issue party in the sense that it has a broader agenda than just the Kurdish question. And so far, the E-Party leader has backed the protests and also said that jailing İmamoğlu is not acceptable. And you have the chairman of Victory Party, who is in jail himself. They have, their main agenda has been this, they built their party based on this very strong anti-refugee sentiment. And it's not going anywhere. Turkey has millions of Syrian refugees, and as the economy struggles further, you will see that party may be appealing more people. So there is a nationalist, there are nationalist parties that are opposed to Erdogan, and I think that might grow a little, given Erdogan is talking with the PKK now. It all depends on what that whole process will yield, right? Right now, Erdogan has mainly managed to distance himself from this peace process, framed it as Devlet Bahçeli's initiative, because he had learned a lesson from the previous peace process, right? That was when he owned the process. He was the public face of the Kurdish opening, and that cost him nationalist votes. So this time around, he wanted to be more cautious, and that's why he made sure that he didn't initially own the process and framed this as a Bahçeli initiative. And also in PKK leader Öcalan's statement that was released to be read to the Kurds, I think Turkish intelligence and government officials really vetted closely those words to make sure that it didn't sound as if it was a quid pro quo. So there was no demands listed there. It was just a unilateral laying down arms. So if Erdogan manages to pull this off, and that's a huge if, that could potentially weaken the anti-Erdogan nationalist front. But as Selim said, this is beyond party politics now. There is a strong popular, and I said this before in 2023, before 2023 elections, I spent a lot of time on the ground talking with people, and we held these little groups. We interviewed them just to understand from different backgrounds, just to understand what people thought of their life in Turkey, life under Erdogan. And the popular opposition, I observed, had never been stronger. So in 2023, had the opposition fielded a better candidate, I think they could have won at the ballot box. So that was in 2023, and things have not gotten better since 2023, right? Economy is doing worse. Institutions have been hollowed out. And the young people, they don't see a future for themselves. I have a father, he's a pensioner, he's 80 years old. And since İmamoğlu's arrest, he's on the street every single day protesting. So you see, and going back to your question about whether this could be, these protests could yield results, I think political science literature says that, you know, protests could be effective in forcing change, but they need to meet certain conditions. And one of the conditions is that they have to form a wide ideological coalition, cross-cutting different classes and different socioeconomic backgrounds. And that's what Özgür Özel is trying to do. And at the popular level, that's where people are. You have Kurds, Turks, seculars, conservatives, young, old. They're all struggling with life under Erdogan. So Özgür Özel is trying to bring them under the same umbrella. So I think, I mean, when we talk about what will happen to these protests and what the CHP strategy is, we should always go beyond the party politics and see what's there. But obviously, there is a huge role for the CHP to play here, because one of the things that political science literature says is that the protests that are led by a strong institutional structure, they have a better shot at succeeding. So the CHP needs to be there, leading the way.
Mm-hmm. And Cihan, I mean, I want to ask you pretty much the same question. I got another question in the chat that is maybe more specifically attuned to some of the points Gönül raised, and I want to ask it to you. You know, this was sent anonymously to me, but since his arrest, İmamoğlu has been referencing the nation using the Turkish word millet, not ulus, and this may be signaling further outreach to right-wing or conservative voters. You know, if İmamoğlu comes to power or remains at the head of this kind of a movement, you know, how does he square these right-wing conservative sensibilities and the social democratic values you were speaking about earlier, that you argue that he's really committed to? I mean, or do you think this is just political communication strategy? I mean, is this outreach to the conservative voters? And I think in mind here is thinking not just the sort of MHP style conservative voters, but like AKP voters, right? Pious Muslim voters. Is this a communication strategy, or how does, in your view, Imamoglu square these ends of the coalition?
I think what Gönül said last is key. To put together a good coalition, you need to be able to lead the coalition. To me, this was the problem thus far, up to 2023 and up to now. It's like the coalitions, if you're the biggest party in the coalition and you don't even have your base shored up, then it's like it looks like you're just trying to be a different version of the thing you're opposing to. And that's the strategy that CHP had employed thus far. For example, democratic values. Why is Demirtas in jail? Why did CHP vote to strip parliamentarians of immunity? Like, why didn't they fight harder when Kurdish municipalities were being trusteed? This is a lot of people are asking this logical question, right? Like, we are familiar with this frustration in the US now. Like, a lot of people who are Democrats and even who are not Democrats are asking, what are you guys doing? Like, this is the time, because it's so, like, to me, to be able to lead a coalition strongly, first you need to strengthen your base, and CHP had neglected this. And Imamoglu to me is a deviation from that. It's like, as you said, a lot of people in society are looking for, from various sectors, have common economic grievances. Like, a lot of you have said this. No future. High schoolers are protesting because their teachers, like the education is defunded and their teachers' contracts are being terminated. They have this, like, the younger generation has a strong sense of no future. I have a friend who's a member of parliament from the pro-Kurdish party. She told me her most popular speech ever was about retirement, not about the Kurdish issue, not about anything. It was like cross appeal, right? Because in Turkey, as well as everywhere else, like, retirees are being shorted, and like they thought they had the resources, and they don't. Like, governments are doing things that are stripping people of social security, of retirement. Like, so what am I trying to say? I think I'm not trained in political science. I'm an anthropologist, and like, so I think a lot of people, but just from participating in politics, or just like, yeah, being in society, I think a lot more people are what in the US I would call like swing voters. Like, I think it's easier to see this in some contexts and harder in others, but especially in moments like this, like, but also in general, like, there's always going to be a strong base to your party, and the size of that might differ, right? But everybody kind of outside of that, if you canvass, like, if you canvass most people, they're gonna tell you things. If you ever canvass for any political campaign, people are gonna tell you things that are very, very incoherent, that are across the ideological spectrum. I think this is a bit truer in the US than it is in Turkey, but it's a bit more polarized, but that seems to be changing as well. And the Islamists in Turkey have not succeeded by thinking, how can we appeal more to the seculars and the left? That happened a little bit later, but first they built a strong Islam space, right? And then they kind of expanded from that. And as Selim said, I think, like, they came to popular power doing this. The Kurdish movements, the electoral civilian side of the Kurdish movement, when they became very successful and had an unprecedented 13%. They had spent years in Kurdish cities building very impressive municipal projects, which were then trusted, but that were like that had very strong bases and were making connections with municipalities across the country as well as internationally. It was very impressive for me to witness this as like a younger person in my early 20s, for example. First, they built a base in Kurdish society and they showed what they can do democratically. Then they expanded this to the West, right? Like in the moment that they did before it got decimated. So to me, that's the question CHP should continue to first and foremost think about. Of course, coalition is important, right? But you can only build a strong coalition by actually being about something. Like you build a base on that, and CHP has neglected this for years. Like, and it like, yeah, like the I think like economic grievances and the strong emphasis on democratic values and not giving up on those, like, and rooting themselves in these values, in social democratic values, maybe also in nationalist values in a way that's, you know, more inclusive. Like that could be the way to go. But yeah, to me, that's always my answer to like any coalition question. You cannot actually strongly lead and put together a coalition when you don't even have your base together. And yes, we are seeing evidence that CHP can take direction from the students, take direction from their base, but it's very new. It's very new, and I think they need to first do that. And I would be scared to see the old tactics come back to me, like they have not worked. Like they've done that in the previous presidential election. How can be a different version of the right wing of politics? That doesn't work. Like people want the real thing. So yeah.
James, there's
Sure, go ahead.
a question posed to me, so I have to leave. Unfortunately, I have another event,
Yeah.
so I would like to give a quick answer. So the question
Sure.
is whether so there's the Serap Hanım is asking, okay, Kurds are entering peace talks from a position of weakness. That's my suggestion. However, why would Bahçeli propose something as significant as allowing Öcalan to speak in Turkish parliament, which seems like a major concession? I think it's a very small price to pay if you end a 4-decade insurgency in return, right? And that's what the ruling coalition is hoping for. They think that this is just a unilateral call on the PKK to lay down arms. If there are other things that had been promised to the Kurds, we're not aware of that. So the way both Bahçeli and Erdoğan put to society is that, so this is the PKK ending, laying down arms and disbanding itself, and that's it. So the only possible thing that the Turkish side, the government side can grant is improving conditions of Öcalan. Again, that's a very small price to pay. We're talking about a 40-year insurgency that has killed 40,000 people. And whether there are regional drivers behind this, that's part of the question. Yes, I think that they are not the primary drivers. I think the primary drivers are domestic, and they have something to do with Erdoğan's efforts to stabilize its autocracy. But obviously the regional factors are, I think they factored into their thinking. In Syria, there's a new era now, and there's a lot. What has happened in Syria has been closely tied to Erdoğan's domestic efforts to consolidate power, right? So this is a new chapter in Syria, and Erdoğan wants to tap into that, into the new developments, to make sure that whatever happens in the post-Assad Syria also helps him at home and in the region, and also in Iraq too. There are significant developments following post-October 7 attacks, and Erdoğan wants to capitalize on that. But one thing that really complicates things for Erdoğan is the PKK presence. both in Syria and Iraq. So certainly regional drivers played a role, but I don't think they were the primary drivers.
Yeah, thank you, Gönül. If you have one more minute, I have one more question for the panel. I'll give you the first go at it, because you had a recent piece in Foreign Affairs that, you know, as headlines do, I won't pin it on you necessarily, but, you know, proclaimed Turkey a full-blown autocracy. And for folks who are familiar with the Middle East, I mean, most of us here are, you know, follow Middle Eastern politics. We have a certain understanding of what authoritarianism and autocracy is. Give us, like, in as brief a way as you can, like, what is different about Erdogan's autocracy from what we're used to seeing in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia or the Gulf or something like that?
Well, let me first say that the editors went a little overboard with the title. The initial title was "Turkey has now become a dictatorship," and we should all care about those nuances, right? They are they are important. So what I was trying to say in that article was that with this latest step of arresting his top rival, Erdogan wanted to turn Turkey's competitive authoritarian regime into a Russia-style autocracy. This is not to say that it has become a Russia-style autocracy. This is to say that's what Erdogan wants to take the country, but we're not there yet. So if you look at it from, if you compare it with others in the region, Turkey is authoritarian, but it still has real political competition and the functioning opposition parties and some pluralism, albeit, I mean, although constrained and under threat. But most Middle Eastern regimes are far more closed. They offer limited or no space for political dissent, organized opposition, or democratic challenge. So that's the main difference. I mean, in the Gulf countries, these monarchies, you have Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Oman. You don't see, there are no national elections for executive leadership, right? Power is concentrated in royal families. Some of them hold maybe municipal or consultative council elections, but these bodies, they don't have any real legislative authority, right? So, and also political parties are banned in most of these states. And if you look at other countries like Egypt, Iran, they hold elections, presidential and parliamentary elections, but candidates are handpicked or they are heavily vetted. And state controls media, it controls judiciary, security, and opposition parties in some cases exist on paper, but they're either co-opted or marginalized or crushed, right? So in that regard, Turkey's competitive authoritarian regime is it's different from what we see in the rest of the region. Elections are real, and outcomes can matter in Erdogan's Turkey. I mean, we have opposition parties, especially at the local level, right? In 2024, the CHP won meaningful power in municipal elections. And media and courts are highly politicized, but there's still independent journalism and opposition voices still exist. And also civil society is active, right? It's increasingly constrained, but it's still active. That's what we saw in these protests. And Erdogan still seeks legitimacy through elections, even if the playing field is tilted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Gönül. And I understand if you have to go, I want to give Selim and Cihan for one more word. But if you need to go, thank you once again for joining us, Gönül. It was great to see you, and thanks for your comments. Be safe, and hopefully see you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Selim, I want to turn back to you real quickly as we close out here. I mean, what to make of Turkey's authoritarianism at this stage, and how might we understand it, you know, at a regional or global level a bit differently now?
Yeah, I think so. If we are to think of the regional global level, I think that's actually one of the things that are kind of suppressing the government's, well, politics in general in Turkey. Because what's different now in Turkey, well, one of the things that are very different now from recent years and decades, is that Turkey's had a lot of success internationally, right? It's just become a much more important country. In that regard, I think in a lot of their stuff, economics, education, certainly, and in the cultural realm, the AK Party has not really met its goals. Right? They keep winning elections, but their policy goals on those they've always fallen short. But one thing they have also done well in is defense procurement, just defense technology, sorry, and foreign policy, especially with the end of the Syrian civil war and the rise of HTS and the Islamist government in Syria. So these guys can now say, justly, I think, that they know how to handle themselves internationally. And actually, when you sort of look at some of the serious people who talk about these things, they will complain about the way the Europeans, for example, conduct themselves internationally. They kind of look down on the Europeans. They say, well, these guys aren't serious. They're liberals who don't know what's going on. The Americans are, of course, the sort of masters in these affairs. The Israelis are very serious, right? But Turkey is now in a position where it can look down on the Europeans because they don't know how to conduct themselves international online. They don't know how to conduct serious diplomacy. They don't really have military power projection capabilities, serious intelligence capabilities, etc. And Turkey now does, right? So when the new Turkish elite looks at something like the Imamoglu arrest and the protests, they're kind of dismissive, and they say, well, we're not the good guys here, but it really doesn't matter, right? Because what's important is that the opposition can't be allowed to win because these guys also aren't very serious. They don't know. They're even less serious than the Europeans. They don't really have hard men. They don't have their own bad men, right? They're just mayors or mediocre politicians. They can't be allowed to get at the levers of this really great thing that we've built. So there is, arguably a great deal of hubris going on there, I think. So internationally, it's not necessarily internationally, but internationally, that's one dimension, right? So Erdogan's in this position where he's dealing with the Chinese, the Indians, Trump, the Europeans, and he just doesn't have a lot of time for these guys. And I don't think that on that stage, that these protests really diminish Erdogan's stature. They might a little bit. It probably stings a little bit. And if some foreign leader would bring this up about how he arrested Imamoglu, Erdogan would probably be upset with that leader, right? That would be a big faux pas. But I don't think that the world is in a place where Erdogan has to hide his head in shame or anything like that, because all of these guys are like this now, which to some extent may not be such a bad thing for Turkey's opposition, because now they can't really credibly be accused of hoping for the Europeans to come to the rescue, hoping for the Americans to come. This was always the thing that Erdogan accused the opposition with, that they didn't really trust their own people, and that they didn't really trust their own base. They were just trying to leverage their way into the international media and build pressure that way on Erdogan. And since that's really no longer possible, they'll have to come up with something else, and maybe that's a healthy thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And Jihan, I want to turn to you to give you the last word. We did have one last question that I think just is a great place to end, I think, and along the line of the discussion we're having on this point about the nature of autocracy. Do you see how do you put the protests for Imamoglu in a global context of resistance, right? Do you think that there's a chance for progressive, democratic movements, solidarity, across national contexts between, let's say, the Democratic Party in the United States or, parties in Eastern Europe or elsewhere in the Arab world at this point to really fight back? What's the internationalist case for the CHP in a way? It's sort of what I'm asking here. How do you see that building out?
I think I was thinking about
ahead.
that as Selim was speaking. There is a grain of truth to this. It is hubris, but there is a grain of truth in terms of it's both a little fair and unfair. That I think CHP is presenting a vision of how they could govern Turkey. And I'm not sure that they've been the strongest in terms of demonstrating how they would manage international relations, what their vision for that is, what they would do in this world, what they would do about relationship with Syria or Middle Eastern countries or the US. I think it is not clear to any, as far as I know, their vision for that is not extremely clear. So in a way, they would need to develop and demonstrate that a little bit. And again, take positions, it is, I don't know about progressive, but I think there's democracy seems to be a common unifier here, and moving away from the culture wars aspect and moving towards common democratic values. And economic grievance seems to have worked. It seems to have some appeal here as well as economic. I mean, there's both seems to have an appeal, the economic grievances plus the some of the undemocratic, and then there's a whole other side to it. So there's we see, for example, in the US how Claudia Sheinbaum is dealing with Trump, right? At very close proximity, that. That maybe provides a model for a different approach, even when you have a lot at stake as a country that's intertwined with the US. I would say Turkey is enough intertwined with the US to be in the same category. But there's not a lot to say other than it would be good for CHP to demonstrate their vision on how they would do that. I don't think they lack the cadre or the talent or people who would join in enthusiastically to help them do that. Thinking back, that's kind of what happened with some elements like Davutoglu, who's now split from, well, not now, a while now, has split from AKP, right? I don't think CHP would have a hard time finding people to write up that program approach. But it's just a matter of charting out that vision and demonstrating it. And I'm guessing that a lot of the work is still people's everyday immediate concerns, but it doesn't hurt to have a vision for how you will govern, both internally and externally, and how it will be maybe like as strong, but in a not the same thing, you know. I think that's a tricky thing, and that's what's been lacking for a long while that we now maybe see changing. But not enough.
Yeah.
It's not enough. Not enough. I would say not enough. It's changing before our eyes, like on the streets and stuff, and maybe at the municipal level as well. But yeah, I think like there's still some work to do there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right in that, you know, there's a clear opportunity here, and the CHP doesn't necessarily lack the human talent to take advantage of it, and it just remains to be seen where things are going. We're at time here, so I just want to thank one more time Selim, Cihan, and Gönül for a really fantastic conversation. I always learn something when I get to talk to you all, and I encourage you to go follow their writing and their work, you know, outside of this space, and perhaps in the pages of MERIP going forward. I also want to thank Shana, Mona Atia, and all the folks at IMES at GW for helping host this event. Thank you guys for being with us. You'll find this recording on YouTube as soon as I get a chance to edit it in the next couple of days. And please sign up for our newsletter, the newsletter at IMES for more updates. You know, so thank you again one more time, and hope you all have a great rest of your day, and keep paying attention to this issue, because it's going to be, I think, a long unfolding story over the next several months. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jim, for having us.
Yep. Bye-bye.